It's a special day today. When we were looking at being over at Ocean in Exmouth, it just seemed timely that World Ocean Day was happening in June. It is a fabulous initiative that always happens on the 8th of June, and the conservation focus for 2021 is 30 by 30. So that is to curb mass extinction and address the climate change. Scientists and conservationists urge that we protect 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030. So we just, obviously it's completely timely that we had this brilliant exhibition programme with Mike and that we could support the campaign for World Oceans Day. But Mike and this exhibition are also spearheading our broader East Devon-wide campaign called Climate Conversations. So we launched Climate Conversations last month, and it's, as I said, a district-wide campaign that will be appearing throughout the summer, working with the Creative Cabin, taking all of our activities and projects out into communities. So hopefully some of you saw some of the worksheets that we developed working with Resource Futures, and we've essentially been trying to marry art and culture and the climate initiative and think about how we can really engage and inspire audiences in a new way. But the programme developed against East Devon District Council's commitment to the Devon Climate Change Emergency Declaration. And this is a pledge to reduce carbon emissions globally by at least 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. This is to avoid the worst effects of climate change by keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. So that's big numbers that sometimes leave you a little bit dumbfounded. And that's why we really love this exhibition and have really enjoyed working with Mike, because it really does offer us a different way to understand the challenge and identify with it. So I would now like to welcome Mike Perry, who has travelled from his home in Pembrokeshire this morning. Mike has had numerous national and international exhibitions of significance, including with the National Museum of Wales and the Venice Biennial. He also has a large solo show opening up at Orley Park in Pembrokeshire next month.
Yeah, July.
We have some subjects that we would like to cover with you this afternoon, but also it is an open conversation, so please just put your hand up and dive in, and Mike and I will be happy to respond. But firstly, we'd just like to think about the location and the context of this exhibition. And so my first question to Mike was just to think about and ask whether it was relevant that THG is located between two AOMBs, Blackdown Hills and East Devon. And obviously Ocean is in Exmouth, which is on the English Channel. And is that important for him when he is selecting the work and agreeing to present it?
To be honest, given COVID, I think I'd have shown in the Hebrides or Falklands, anywhere. It's been so hard the last couple of years. But no, I think, look, toxic oceans, climate change, biodiversity loss, all this is getting to such a level, such a problem that I think I'd like the work to show in urban settings and rural. I don't think there's a difference really. I think you've got sensitive people in the cities and you've got sensitive people in the countryside and the opposite as well. So no, I think the rural setting wasn't an issue. I think the fact that you do have these two areas, these two national parks that suffer or have some of the similar issues that are in Pembrokeshire and Scotland, the Peak District, the Lake District, to do with monoculture and lack of biodiversity. I think that does make it relevant perhaps for people coming here. They can see these places on the doorstep, they're aware of them. And also you have a beautiful coastline, which I'm assuming after storms, you get this plastic, washing up in Pembrokeshire. Being on the west, after a big storm, most of the west-facing beaches are literally covered in plastic. So I'm sure there is a relevance being here, but it's not just about showing the work in the countryside now.
And what made you start picking up plastics?
Like a lot of people, I was sort of dumped on the beach when I was young. My dad was a prof of biochemistry, and my mum was a painter, and we had these long holidays, and I'd just end up picking up things. In those days it was sort of stones and interesting shells and things, and then I started getting into coloured glass, the glass that washes up, and I made a whole wall of my bathroom in glass once, those bits of coloured glass. And then about 2010 I'd moved to Wales, the plastic started arriving, and I started picking them up and I started putting them into little books. Photographing them with my phone, small camera. I had all these books, and I felt a bit like a sort of natural history, sort of scientist. But the truth is, I got bored of that, and I realised it wasn't me. I'm not a scientist, although I'm interested in stuff. I was more interested in the actual, taking these objects and some mundane object and photographing, perhaps turning a mundane, banal object into something of significance. And so, looking at the sculptural qualities or the way nature shapes and shapes our world and breaks these things down into interesting shapes. That's what really motivated me. So yeah, that's how I started really. It was starting with collecting loads and then turning them into sort of individual pieces.
Pieces in any way, and do you refine them slightly to make them more aesthetic, or do you take exactly what you saw?
No, the approach was very much to be, I don't want to use the word objective, that's impossible, but to shoot them one-to-one as their size, as I found them, to shoot them straight to camera, not to light them in any kind of dramatic way and imbue them with any kind of romantic or drama. So to shoot them in very neutral light in a way that makes you look at the object as it really is. And so there's no change. I might take a bit of dust out or something, but there's no manipulation of the object. I want people to look at these things like they're bits of rubbish you'd normally walk past and go, why is he photographing that? And try and find occasionally a bit of poetry in doing that, but also to get people to see actually how these things break down in reality, and the scratch marks. On the one hand, you see them, as sculptural objects, but then when you start thinking about them, you realize that this is all breaking down into archaeology, and so I'm not manipulating them. I'm just trying to show them as cleanly as I can, so you see them for what they are.
It's interesting, though, because you have made them beautiful, as you have made your landscapes beautiful.
Yeah.
And your work has often been discussed in relation to the notion of the sublime. How do you understand this yourself?
Well, when I first started, because I was late coming to art, I had a former life, and when I first started making these things, a couple of people said, isn't there a contradiction there? You're making these bits of toxic into beautiful things or nice photographs. And I was very worried about this, and I think this is wrong. Then I spoke to a couple of artists who I really valued. They just said, no, Mike, this is something that artists deal with, and there's always been ugly beautiful, from Shakespeare's bittersweet. Nietzsche said there's no beautiful surface without a terrible depth, and I think there is a theme in a lot of art where artists play with this idea of beauty and ugliness or reality, and so that tension was there. And once I realized that actually it was just my way, I still find them beautiful, and that's the honest thing as an artist. I can pick up something that I know is toxic, but for me has aesthetic opportunities. It's a way of me both being an artist, but also telling the narrative so people can see what's happening in these things. It does both at the same time. And I've now I'm now okay with that idea of things can be beautiful or also dangerous or polluting.
One of my favourite works is the work upstairs with the bench, where you can really see that presence of the human. But there is, in all your landscapes, there's human action, but there isn't actually figurative.
Yeah, I was asked to do a residency by the Welsh Arts Council in Mid Wales, a place called Elan Valley, and it's called the Elan Valley Nature Reserve. And you read all the brochures, and it's all, wonderful conservation. It's this incredible place, and pictures of the reservoirs, in magic hour and everything. And when I arrived, I'd been there sort of half an hour and just got up above the reservoirs, and the area is completely empty, and huge parts of Wales, much worse than say Devon, huge parts of Wales are now this empty kind of like mown grass landscape. And I just saw this bench just sort of placed in a position where it's sort of just looking out into the empty horizon. I thought it's just the perfect kind of symbol to ask the question, is this beautiful untouched landscape where one can go and find oneself and find solitude or get away from the city for a couple of days, because some people believe that is and argue very vociferously that's what it is. Or is this kind of a view of a kind of post-apocalyptic nightmare where there's very low biodiversity because all the sheep eat everything, nothing can grow, no trees come up, and the soil gets acidic and the water runs off and causes flooding in the towns below. Which is it? You know, I am, the more I've worked and with in my practice in these sort of areas, the more I believe these are huge areas of opportunity for regeneration. And actually, I think they'll not just be good for nature, for biodiversity, for climate change, sequestering carbon, but also they'll regenerate the communities there that lives, you know, very difficult lives, those hill farming Welsh lives. A lot of the young people leave the villages and the towns, they go to the cities, and I think regenerating areas like Mid Wales, the area that bench was looking into, would be good for everybody. And so, yeah, the bench was a symbol of the debate that I get. And I've stood up I did a talk up in Aberystwyth, and I didn't realise that the key person coming was this very charismatic, good-looking young Welsh farmer who had also been a soap star at some stage. And he was speaking in Welsh and allowed it to be translated, you know, so I couldn't speak to him direct. But he was so brilliant on his feet, and he said, "You English, come here and you tell us how to." He was brilliant. I've got to be honest. I'm sort of shrinking, you know. And he would see, if he was sitting on that bench, he would see beauty, his ancestors, and a community, Welsh hill farming. That's what it's about. So, yeah, the bench is a symbol of the debate, I think. Yeah.
So do you think that humans can live in harmony with the planet? I've read around your work in relation to the concept of Anthropocene, which has been criticised by some scholars as appearing to suggest that humanity as a whole is responsible for the environmental damage caused. What do you think?
The word Anthropocene is really, I don't use it anymore because I've been pulled up so many times by very clever academics that, you know, tell me why it's wrong. And I do see nature's always been in transition. The landscapes have always changed. And there is no ideal landscape. It's always in change. And for tens of thousands of years, that's been the case. And I accept that. But the reality is, in the last 50 years, or just my lifetime, the changes that us humans have done is extraordinary. And so we still have to have some term to talk about how now nature is so affected by human impacts. Yeah.
I think you're right. It is that the passage of time, isn't it? It's about trying to show change. And we were talking earlier, and I'm sure some of you saw the show that we had here last summer, which was Richard Long's Being in the Moment here, which is a Tate exhibition. And we had the stone circle where the plastiglomerates now are. And we were talking about how it's such a different process of picking up.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it's only happened in my lifetime. I mean, I used to pick up bits of coloured glass, but you know, now a lot of the rocks, a lot of people won't see these things, but now I can see them. You know, that's plastic, and I pick it up, and you only know by its weight that it's plastic. Our geology is changing, and that's happened very recently. And you asked me just earlier about, you know, do I think we can live, you know, in harmony? And I think, yeah, we've got the technologies. This idea that we need to research, you know, they already exist. It's about renaissance in our thinking, about how to live in harmony and sustainably. And I think that's, whether that happens, is going to be a battle against the vested interests that don't want the change. You know, whether it's individuals or powerful superpowers that want chaos and profit from chaos, or whether it's, if you like, the new nationalism and sort of far right that kind of is questioning all science. You know, there are very powerful vested interests in not listening to science and making things better.
So colour and form are as important to you as the message, or at least in balance?
Yeah, I think some pieces I'm fascinated by. I mean, the colour's an interesting thing. Roland Barthes talked about when plastic started coming out in the 50s and 60s, he talked about this awful disgraced material called plastic that had none of the mineral values of real colour, and if only he'd, you know, was around now, he'd see first of all how plastic is mimicking the mineral materials he talked about, but also how plastics have actually, after 50 years in the sea, sometimes they've softened and changed, and so some of these colours do appeal to me. So some of my works are to do with colour, others are to do with the form. The black and white grids are much more about form. I think some of them, the narrative is stronger. I'm interested in the narrative behind the piece, and some just pure the abstraction of a piece of colour or shape. I think it varies, and the one thing I have found is often it's the most mundane piece, the piece that's like kind of banal, that offers nothing when you look at it as an object, makes the better work. Perhaps that's because photography has added something. And I'd find some most extraordinary things on beaches, like the back of a computer that's just got shells and animals eating it and everything. But I could never take a more interesting photograph than the actual piece itself. And so that's been a learning for me, which is actually, so what am I doing? You know, maybe that's where I should just show the object. But I'm not a sculptor, so it's interesting that what actually works and what doesn't work. And I'm learning, and yeah. No, I think it's. I just was of an age and involved where I just started to notice it and became interested in it. It has obviously been building up before that, but I think was a huge acceleration in everybody's awareness, and also I think of the amount that started getting washed in the last 15, 20 years. I think if you look at the amounts, I can't remember the figure on the number of cubic tons of plastic every single day goes in the oceans around the world. It's astronomical. And I think it's just been a real acceleration. And now when we see the satellite pictures of, they're called gyres in the middle of the oceans, they're the size of Texas, you know, they're sitting there in the middle of every ocean. And every time there's a big storm, a bit might break away and it washes up on the coast. Those have just got larger and larger, and we're now much more aware. I suspect the plastic's been there and it's just gradually built up. There was no point. It's just my awareness of it. And I think also then the awareness in culture, we started talking about it. We didn't really talk about it before. I'm not aware before, about 2015, that sort of time, you know. Yeah.
Your talk about biodiversity reminded me of George Monbiot's book, and we've got a place just up the road where they're rearing wolves and bears and things to be rewilded.
Yeah.
Would you go that far, do you think, in North Wales?
I think George Monbiot's book Feral was wonderful and brought a lot of people, made them aware of how to look at some of these landscapes, which I have a lot of artist friends that come and see me from London. I used to live in London who still think those open spaces are beautiful spaces, and he wrote very eloquently on that subject. I think the whole issue of rewilding is a difficult one. For some people it's the wrong word. It upsets a lot of the farming community because it's too general. It's I think regeneration may be a better word, but I think there's different solutions for every, if you like, site or place. In some cases, yes, I think we should go, particularly in places like Scotland where there's the space, and try and get the full habitats back, right from the top predator, the wolf, right down. Because the research has shown that if you do that, actually, it affects all sorts of things. It affects rivers slow down, you get more growth around rivers, you get higher biodiversity, it brings in other species, and it can be very effective. It's not just the term having a wolf there, it actually has an effect on balancing and keeping sustainable. I mean, there was a funny thing in his book where he said, I think, there were a lot of people complaining in America about the same thing in the parks, bringing wolves back, and someone did the statistic, and I think more people had died by fruit machines falling on top of them than being killed by a wolf, So this whole thing about the danger of them is ridiculous, but it doesn't have to, you don't think you have to go to that level. I think you can take small plots of land and allow them to regenerate. I think there can be a balance between farming and regeneration. I think it's, in some cases, go to that extreme. Let's see what happens if you just leave nature. But I think one thing that is coming through from a lot of the research is that this idea that there's nature and us is, I think, a real problem. Humans are part of nature, and we've always been part of nature, and often you get higher biodiversity when humans are involved with nature, when they're creating sustainable forests because they need the wood. when they are involved in a form of agriculture that's sustainable. So yeah, I think the idea of this kind of romantic idea, leave nature to be itself, and we'll go and visit it. I don't think that's always the healthy solution looking forward. I think humans can be very much involved, and I think you can regenerate cities. When I lived in Hackney, there was more biodiversity and the canals in the East End than there was in Mid Wales. There's no question, much more. And I think all people growing their gardens, their back gardens, there's more biodiversity in some cities, and from the back gardens, and there are these huge areas of sheep farming in Mid Wales. So, yeah, I think regeneration can happen everywhere. You don't have to have a wolf in your back garden.
Over many years I've collected things from the beach. I'm a landscape painter, and the things I find on the beach, a bit of driftwood or a bit of painted wood that fell off a boat, is far more beautiful than anything that I've ever made. And I collect and keep those, but I also kind of muse on the fact that, when I make an acrylic painting or an oil painting, that's not sustainable in many ways, and the materials I use are not sustainable. I worry about the fact that when you collect materials off the... a question, for example, what do you do with the things that you collect? All the plastic you collect, what happens to it? Do you treasure it forever, or do you discard of it socially responsibly, or how do you deal with that?
I ended up having a barn full of plastic bottles. I had this idea of making this huge grid, but and I eventually got rid of 90% of it. I took it to the council, to their recycling, and they were very happy to take it. So there wasn't a problem with that. Your first issue about some things that come in sometimes are so beautiful you can't make better work. I mean, I think that's interesting. I found also some things that nature is the ultimate designer, is the ultimate shaper of things, and so sometimes it is hard to not compete. But I think in my experience is that sometimes what art does, it just takes something that perhaps you wouldn't normally look at and give it something, and in that that's where the kind of poetry is, or that's where the significance is. Yeah, there are a lot of people in Pembrokeshire. I mean, I suspect the same is down. There's a lot of galleries where a lot of people making landscapes still and seascapes, and sell very, very well, and they're very popular with people. And it's I was doing a talk it was the National Museum Wales residency, and I showed some work at the end of it, and I had a row of my shoes at the back, and as I was talking, I recognised a gentleman in the back, and it's a very well-known traditional seascape painter, and he sort of looked at me like I just see him, waiting to give me the killer question that would, kill me on my feet. And he did. He sort of, right, the last question of the day, I thought I'd done pretty well. He sort of said, explain to me your shoes. You seem to be giving them too much reverence, too much, when they're just plastic pollution. And it sort of dropped me dead, actually. And it's a typical thing that happened. The answer I should have said, which I remembered in the car on the way home, was actually, you and I do the same thing. You use your hand to express what nature does with waves and things. I'm just using my camera, but nature's made these designs on these objects. So I'm capturing the same thing. We're both, if you like, admiring and in awe of the powers of nature. Just we do it a different way. But of course, that was the on the way home thought. Yeah, I did a talk at Cardiff University in the art school there, and thought it'd gone pretty well, and this young first-year student stood up and said, "So, have you flown in the last 5 years?" Yes, I had, actually. And it was like, you could see everyone go, "Oh, how's he going to get out that one?" But I think it's about balance, isn't it? And if everybody does a little bit in all areas of their life, you can make a huge impact. So, for example, buying your electricity through a green, 100% renewable energy supplier, cutting down on your flights, not stopping all flights, just cutting down, perhaps thinking another way of doing everything. And for example, the waste issue. When we shop, we take an old bag and we fill it. We don't use plastic bags, but I still meet friends, artist friends, of them have come up with hundreds of plastic bags. It's unnecessary. So I think if everybody does a bit, it creates an energy, and the new markets emerge. And you can't completely guilt yourself to death, because we all have impacts, and we can deal with that. With new technologies, we can still deal with a little bit of carbon, but it's just the extent and the speed of which it's getting out of control. Yeah, it is very depressing to see what's happening with China. China, on the one hand, is doing a lot of really good things to do with climate change, but it's also still opening coal. It's sort of both. It's a contradiction. But if everybody just gets up on the phone and changes their energy supply to green, or that creates a huge wave. I mean, if you look what's happening with, say, Exxon, the company now, which has caused, I think it's 20% of all carbon emissions. It's a company that's denied climate change for many decades. Suddenly now, on its board, are now, I think it's 2 or 3 fund managers who want to change the company. And it's there because the markets want to change the company, because big reinvestment companies do not want to invest in oil because it's going to be a bad asset. It's going to be a stranded asset. And these oil companies are really facing it because of people, like you say yourself, just doing something very small, and it all adds up around the world. And when a lot of people ring their pension, go to pension and say, is my pension, any of my pensions in oil or fossil fuels? And they go, yeah. I say, well, can you move it to a managed fund? Okay, no problem. When that starts happening and millions of people do that, those big investment companies have a huge impact on the fossil fuels. So, it's that whole thing of the little butterfly. Everybody doing a little thing can have a huge impact on the markets. And it's the markets that are going to change things. It's money. It's when those fossil fuel realize there is no money to be made by continuing. In fact, they lose money. Unfortunately, that, is still the most powerful tool we have, voting with our feet. Yes. Totally. Totally, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, Coca Cola, unbelievably, still saying they won't change the single plastic, the main cup, until the consumer wants them to. I mean, how ridiculous. That's just absurd and outrageous. And I hope that doesn't get me into trouble. I know they have a huge... there are, yeah, but I mention them because they should be leading, but it's, if everybody stopped, if they could, and they're so addicted to Coke, buying Coke for a week, my God, that would shock the board, because suddenly the CEO has to go, our numbers are down. Why is that? Because people don't want you to be, making this single plastic bottles that end up floating around the world and breaking down into the sea. There's terrible medical, equipment waste and plastics, and also everyone's shopping online, and that can be good and it can be bad, online shopping, depending on what the packaging is and where it comes from and how it comes. But one of the good things maybe is it has made people recognize how much they value being in nature and having nature around them. And one of the most positive things I can remember from COVID is an image I saw on Google. It was right at the beginning of COVID, and it's when of an 18-year-old student in Beijing, Chinese student, looking up at the sky and seeing blue sky for the first time in his life. That's such a moving image, the possibilities of clean air. I think that went around the world, and seeing fish in Venice in the canals. These are things you can see show light of what is possible. And maybe the pandemic has given us a glimpse whether we as nation and around the world actually go back to our old habits, the crazy cheap flights that were subsidized or to parts of Spain and things, people going 4 or 5 times a year for weekends. It's crazy. That's just madness, and hopefully people can see how beautiful Britain can be by taking a different type of holiday. And yeah, one of the things that COVID has done is I was going to get a camper van and go around Britain, and I was commissioned to do a piece of work in Exmoor by Exeter University, but that all came to a halt, and I was going to go up in the rewilded estates up in Scotland, but I've been sort of walking from the small holding that I live in, Pembrokeshire, making work close, and that's been nice actually. You realise that actually the issues are close at hand. You don't have to go off in a camper van, so it's been quite good. And I've been making some work about a project I'm calling Outcasts, which is the kind of the hedgerow trees, the hawthorns, the willows, the blackthorns, the trees that get, particularly where I am, shoved into the hedgerow and cut, have the heads cut off every year. We're now recognising that hedgerow is so important for biodiversity and birds in particular. And farmland bird populations have gone down since, I think, 1970 by 60% or something. So I'm making work about things like sort of subjects, about trees that are these kind of outcast trees and sort of parallel with sort of immigrants and how they get shoved into the places no one wants to live. And you know, you look at some of the big farms, the really big agribusiness farms, that there are no hedgerows left. There's just and so I want to try and write about these kind of these beautiful trees that don't have the status of the grand oak tree. I've also been making work about ash dieback. It's a huge thing in Pembrokeshire. I don't know how bad it is here in Devon, but whether it's because we're right by the sea. I mean, where we are on our farm, we've about 50 or 60 ash trees, and all of them are dying back. And so it's so sad, because it's ash trees are not only beautiful, they're a partner tree. They allow light through to wildflowers underneath them, and they have this hissing sound, the wind. It's a real memory. It's going to change the whole British landscape. So I'm making work about, I'm shooting a particular tree that's dying back every few weeks. And I've actually been also photographing, someone talked about, online things that arrive. I've got so much cardboard as we buy these sort of, from this organic produce and stuff, and I've got so much cardboard. What can I do with this? And photographing bits of cardboard. The artist Rauschenberg did this years and years ago, made some beautiful works, and so I'm just using photography to try and mediate this sort of the blandest jiffy bag, for example. I've been shooting jiffy bags, thinking, if I can make this interesting, then that's a challenge. So that's what COVID does to you. You start photographing jiffy bags. Well, on the downside, I spoke to Professor Thompson at Plymouth University, who's the lead marine biology there, the lead expert on microplastics. And I said, if I put a glass into the ocean where I live, I was doing a talk somewhere, how many bits of plastic would there be plastic there for definite there? He said, yeah. I said, how many? He said, between 200,000 and 400,000 pieces. I said, that can't be true. He said, yeah, they break down to such tiny bits. So it's everywhere now. Bottles just break down to millions and millions of molecules. So the scale of the problem is enormous. The bit of good news, picking up on your point, is that they have discovered that certain, is it algae or bacteria, microorganisms, have found a way to eat this stuff and break it down. I mean, you have to wonder, where does that molecule, that PCB go? Is it actually destroyed for good? But there are signs that there is some breakdown of this. And I think technologically, in some ways, sorting climate change and capturing carbon could be easier than getting all the plastics in the ocean, because we know how to do that. We just regenerate plant, cut down on our usage. We've got the technologies, wind, solar, and batteries now coming through. We can do that. It's just about political will. But with microplastics, I don't know. I don't know enough about it to know what the solutions to that are.
Well, thank you all so much for coming and joining us today. Mike will be back on the 1st of July with curator Ben Bothwick, who is the creative director of CAST. So Ben curated the original iteration of Land Sea with David Drake from Photo Gallery in Cardiff. So I would just also like to thank our partners for this fabulous project, which runs until the 14th of August. And I'd also just like to again thank Mike, who's been fabulous. I know my team have all really enjoyed working with him, and also to thank my team who've been brilliant throughout lockdown, always enthusiastic and passionate about the gallery. And last but not least, just let you know, if you'd like to keep in touch with us, we've just launched ACE, which is Arts and Culture East Devon, and that's a network East Devon wide to bring us together to support cultural innovation across East Devon. So thank you all for coming.